Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a biological mystery that's, well, it's as deeply personal as it is profoundly counterintuitive. We're looking at a brand new paper exploring the intersection of two of the most universally feared diagnoses in human history, cancer and Alzheimer's disease. But before we get into the hard data, it's really important we ground ourselves in the human reality of these illnesses. Because understanding the science, it requires us to look at devastating loss through a completely new lens. Take L. Rebecca Feng, for instance. She's the author of the paper we're examining today. She lost her husband, her best friend of 13 years, to glioblastoma, which, as you probably know, is the most aggressive form of primary brain cancer. He was only 46 years old. And despite being in excellent health and receiving advanced treatments, the disease took his life in just 15 months. But here's the thing. Before the cancer ultimately took his life, it robbed him of his memories. It took his very essence. It's a tragic process that she points out is agonizingly similar to Alzheimer's disease. These two illnesses, they just share so much in the sheer devastation they cause families.
But this shared tragedy, it leads us to a fascinating, honestly almost unbelievable biological question. What if I told you that having one of these devastating diseases actually builds a biological shield against the other? I know, it sounds like pure science fiction, but as we're about to see, it's a hard, measurable scientific fact.
Okay, let's dive into this. That number right there, it represents a staggering piece of epidemiological data. Studies consistently show that patients who've been diagnosed with cancer actually have a 25 to 35% reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Just think about that for a second. Even though both of these diseases share major risk factors, obviously the biggest one being aging, the presence of cancer actively pushes the risk of Alzheimer's down. And get this, the inverse is also true. If we flip the perspective, the risk of developing cancer in patients who already have Alzheimer's disease is reduced by a massive 50%. It's literally cut in half. If you have Alzheimer's, your body somehow becomes fiercely resistant to cancer.
Now, scientists naturally ask the logical question, is this just some statistical fluke? Could it be a diagnostic bias, or maybe simply that patients just don't live long enough to get the second disease? The answer is a definitive no. Rigorous methodological studies have completely ruled those biases out. In fact, this is what researchers call a dose-dependent phenomenon, meaning if an individual has a history of two completely different cancers, their onset of Alzheimer's is delayed even further than someone who only had one cancer. And crucially, this protective effect is uniquely tied to Alzheimer's. It doesn't apply to other age-related neurodegenerative issues, like vascular dementia or Huntington's disease.
And we don't just see this in population statistics, right? We can actually see it right under a microscope. Researchers at the University of Kentucky Alzheimer's Disease Research Center examined post-mortem brain tissue to find the physical evidence. And what they found was that a prior cancer diagnosis meant a physically lower burden of Alzheimer's pathology, specifically way fewer of those notorious amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And when examining the brains of glioblastoma patients, researchers found that the areas of the brain heavily coded in Alzheimer's plaques had almost zero tumor infiltration. The cancer cells literally could not, or would not, grow in the areas where Alzheimer's pathology was present and vice versa. It's like an invisible boundary line. So why exactly is this happening? Mechanistically, cancer and Alzheimer's represent this wild evolutionary trade-off. They're complete biological opposites. Cancer is fundamentally a disease of sustained cell proliferation. Cells are multiplying entirely out of control. Alzheimer's, on the other hand, is a disease of increased cellular death. Cancer successfully evades the immune system so it can survive, while Alzheimer's upregulates immune activation, causing all this chronic inflammation. Fundamentally, cancer is a perverse form of cellular immortality, whereas Alzheimer's is defined by excessive cellular destruction. And this brilliantly illustrates how we have the exact same biological components at play here, but their switches are flipped in completely opposite directions. Take the p53 gene, for example. In cancer, it loses its function, and that's what allows tumors to grow uncontrollably. But in Alzheimer's, that exact same gene is highly activated, which actually induces those toxic tau tangles in the brain. Then consider the PIN1 enzyme. It's highly expressed in most cancers, basically acting as a green light for rapid cell growth, but in Alzheimer's, it has very low expression, which leads to brain decay. A biological environment that heavily favors one disease makes it incredibly hostile for the other. This genetic tug-of-war gives us some massive real-world clues, too. First, let's look at Down syndrome. Individuals with Down syndrome have a greater than 90% lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and that's largely driven by the genetics of their condition. Yet remarkably, their risk of developing solid tumors is less than half that of the general population. That extra 21st chromosome is this perfect real-world genetic example of this reciprocal protection playing out across an entire lifespan. Next, consider APOE4, the most famous genetic risk factor for late-onset Alzheimer's. You'd think a gene so heavily associated with neurodegeneration would just be universally harmful, right? Well, it turns out having that specific gene is actually associated with favorable outcomes if you happen to get melanoma. Even the real villains of Alzheimer's, APP and amyloid beta, which we've spent billions trying to eradicate from the brain, they've been shown to act directly as tumor suppressors in various environments. It's just wild.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we might actually use this biology to save lives. Because if cancer naturally suppresses Alzheimer's, can we somehow bottle that mechanism? Well, recent studies show it might actually be possible. Researchers found that peripheral tumor cells secrete a protein called cystatin C. And when they tested this tumor-derived protein in Alzheimer's mouse models, it actually reduced the amyloid burden in their brains and rescued their cognition. A protective factor secreted from a tumor actually fixed the Alzheimer's. This opens up entirely new, previously unexplored therapeutic targets. But to unlock these cures, medicine really needs what's known as the Medici effect. If you aren't familiar, this is the concept that breakthrough innovations happen right at the intersection of diverse, seemingly unrelated fields. For decades, oncology, the study of cancer, and neurology, the study of Alzheimer's, have basically existed in completely different silos. They have separate conferences, separate journals, totally separate funding streams. Bringing them together represents the ultimate Medici effect just waiting to happen.
Take a look at the infrastructure we already have. Across the United States, there are 35 dedicated Alzheimer's disease research centers and 73 designated cancer centers. But the real key here is that third category. More than 30 institutions currently house both centers on the exact same campus. There is this massive, untapped opportunity for these brilliant minds to literally just walk across the quad, share their infrastructure, and cross-pollinate their ideas.
And what's going to make this collaboration truly powerful? The datasets. We're talking about billions of dollars worth of existing data completely ready to be converged right now. Just look at the sheer scale of the information waiting for us. 58,000 whole genomes from the Alzheimer's sequencing project, 300 million protein measurements from the Global Consortium, 500,000 cancer genomic samples from the Game On initiative. These aren't just abstract numbers, folks. They represent millions of patient lifetimes of incredibly detailed biological information. By feeding these massive, historically siloed datasets into advanced AI and machine learning systems, researchers can finally map out the precise mechanisms of this inverse correlation. We can identify hidden biomarkers and accelerate novel therapeutics at a scale and speed that was simply impossible just a few short years ago. The math is ready, we just need to do the collaborative work.
But we have to act fast. I want to bring us back to the human cost here. The publication date of this paper is incredibly recent. This is not old history. This is an active, urgent frontier. Both cancer and Alzheimer's remain fatal. Current therapies, while improving every single day, still leave so many declining or dying far too soon. As the author notes, transformative innovation isn't just some nice idea, it's an absolute necessity right now. Because for millions of patients and families facing these devastating diagnoses, time is quite literally a luxury they cannot afford. So we'll leave you with this final provocative thought. For decades, we've treated the brain and the body as if they were battling completely different enemies. But the biology tells a completely different story, one of a delicate opposing balance. Could the key to curing cancer be hiding right there in the brains of Alzheimer's patients? And could the cure for Alzheimer's have been locked inside cancer tumors this whole time? The clues are right in front of us. Now the medical fields just need to work together to read them. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer.